Welcome back to the deep dive, where we, dig into your source material. For this deep dive, you provided some excerpts from Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And, honestly, I get why this book, struck a chord with so many people.
Yeah.
His writing style. It's like that friend we all have, who devours books and can make even Nietzsche sound like a conversation you'd have over coffee.
Right. He's just so engaging. And he blends this, really academic background with this raw, almost stream of consciousness style. It's actually kind of remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah. And those chapter titles. Come on. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today.
He knows how to suck you in.
How can you not want to read on after that?
Yeah, totally. And what's really striking to me is that beneath those kind of catchy titles, Peterson's grappling with these universal experiences. It's stuff we all deal with. Confronting the unknown, trying to make sense of the world. It's almost like 12 Rules for Life is kind of like this accessible entry point to his bigger, more complex ideas. You see those more in something like Maps of Meaning.
Okay. So for someone who maybe hasn't quite, taken the Peterson plunge yet,
yeah,
what's the core idea behind Maps of Meaning?
So Maps of Meaning is basically an exploration of how we as humans create meaning. And how we find purpose, especially when we're faced with chaos and uncertainty. Imagine trying to build, a house, but you don't have any blueprints. That's kind of what life can feel like without a sense of meaning, right?
Right, yeah.
Peterson argues that our minds naturally try to create order out of chaos, just like our ancestors did when they looked up at the stars and started seeing constellations.
Oh, that's interesting. So how do the 12 Rules for Life, how do those rules play into all of this?
Think of the rules as a framework for building those blueprints that we were just talking about.
Okay.
He's really tackling these basic but profound human struggles. We've all been told to stand up straight by our mothers, probably.
Yeah.
But Peterson, he connects that to, social hierarchies. He even draws this fascinating, if a little strange, parallel to lobsters.
Lobsters. Okay, you're going to have to explain this one.
Okay. So lobsters, like us, they have social structures.
Okay.
And get this, their serotonin levels, that feel-good chemical in our brains, are actually tied to their position in the hierarchy.
Really?
Higher-ranking lobsters have more serotonin.
Wow.
Which might sound crazy, but think about it. Confident posture, it actually makes you feel better.
It's true. It's like that physical action can actually have a psychological effect.
Exactly. And this ties into the rule. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Peterson argues that by improving your posture, you might actually be able to, regulate your mood. It's this small change that could have a big impact. He also uses the example of a panic attack, which I think we can all relate to. Have you ever, felt your heart racing in, a crowded mall or something?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The worst.
Right. So that is a prime example of a positive feedback loop spiraling out of control.
Okay.
Peterson illustrates how that feeling of panic, it can actually make your heart race even faster, which in turn just fuels more panic.
Oh, wow.
And this can apply to all areas of life, even something as simple as forgetting to take your medication properly. It can spiral and make things feel much more chaotic.
Yeah, it's these small things, if you let them pile up, they can create this sense of being totally overwhelmed.
Absolutely. And this is where the rule, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, comes in. Peterson argues that before we try to fix all the world's problems, we need to focus on creating order in our own lives first.
Right.
It doesn't mean you have to achieve some perfect state, but it's about taking responsibility for those small things. The things you actually have some control over.
Right. And I think one of the most relatable things Peterson talks about is that inner voice, that internal critic that's always there telling us that we're not good enough, we're not doing enough. And it's so easy to fall into that trap of comparison, especially in the age of social media.
Oh, it's constant.
Constant comparison.
It's like that rule, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today, is more important now than ever, I think.
Totally.
Peterson reminds us that by focusing on our own progress, however small, it's so much more productive than constantly comparing ourselves to others. You mentioned earlier, feeling a bit stuck in your career, and it makes me think about how Peterson explains Price's Law.
Okay. Price's Law. Refresh my memory on that one.
Okay, so basically it states that in any field, whether it's art, business, whatever, the square root of the number of people producing half the output accounts for half of everything. So a small percentage of people are often responsible for a huge portion of the impact. It sounds complex, but think of it this way. He even uses the success of his own book as an example.
Oh, wow.
It stemmed from a single, highly engaging answer he gave on Quora.
Wow.
It really highlights how even small, consistent actions can lead to significant outcomes. So, those small steps you're taking in your career, even if you don't see results immediately,
Right.
they could be building towards something bigger.
I love that. Okay. But let's be honest. Peterson isn't all sunshine and roses. There's this recurring theme of sacrifice in the book that can feel a bit heavy at times. What's the deal with that?
Well, he connects it to this, uniquely human capacity we have for delayed gratification. This ability to endure suffering now for something better down the line, He uses the biblical story of Cain and Abel, the one where Cain kills his brother out of jealousy, to highlight how destructive that resentment for what we lack can be.
It's a pretty intense example.
Yeah, he's not afraid to use these dramatic narratives to drive his point home. There's this section where he talks about Socrates accepting his death sentence, and he frames it as this incredibly courageous act, choosing a meaningful ending rather than clinging to an existence that's diminishing.
Wow.
It's about finding meaning, even when you're faced with really difficult situations.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
Yeah.
And, he also doesn't shy away from sharing his own personal experiences. Especially with his friend Chris.
Yeah, Chris's story. It's deeply personal and unfortunately tragic. He struggled with addiction for a long time and he never quite found that, path toward meaning that Peterson talks about. And he ultimately died by suicide.
It's really sad.
It's a reminder that not everyone finds their way, and the consequences of failing to do so, they can be devastating.
Yeah. It's a lot to unpack. And we're not even through part one of your deep dive. Peterson's work really makes you think, and sometimes it even makes you uncomfortable.
He challenges conventional thinking, and he definitely isn't afraid to dive into controversial topics.
Yeah.
But that's what makes his work so compelling. It sparks debate, and it forces you to look inward.
Right.
He's asking us to confront those hard questions, the ones we often try to avoid.
Right. It's definitely a lot to process. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I think it's time we take a pause here. What do you say? We pick back up with part 2 and explore Peterson's thoughts on societal structures, gender dynamics, and maybe even squeeze in some cat petting.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready when you are.
It's funny. Peterson goes from these lobsters and serotonin to ancient myths and biblical stories, all within a few pages. It's kind of wild.
It is kind of all over the place.
He seems to just pull from these really different realms to illustrate his points.
Yeah. It's definitely part of what makes his work so unique. He's blending psychology, philosophy, even theology to create this really rich way of looking at things. And he argues that all of these seemingly random areas are actually interconnected and that they reflect these universal truths about the human experience.
Okay, so speaking of universal truths, in the last part we ended on some pretty heavy stuff like addiction, meaning even suicide. But we also touched on something a little lighter, which was Peterson's whole thing about petting cats.
Right.
What is the deal with that? It feels so random.
It does seem a little out there. It's almost like a throwaway line in the book. But I think if you really think about it, it speaks to this idea of being present,
Okay.
Engaging with the world around you, even in these small ways. It's this tiny act of acknowledging something or someone else, this little furry creature that's crossing your path.
Yeah. It reminds me of that quote, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity.
Oh, I like that.
Maybe that's kind of what he's getting at, finding those moments of connection, even just with a, cat on the street.
Yeah, exactly. And those little moments, those seemingly insignificant moments, they can actually be really grounding. They can offer a much needed break from the chaos of our own thoughts,
Yeah. Totally. So switching gears a bit, one of the things I found both fascinating and a bit unsettling was Peterson's example of the client who couldn't distinguish between her husband and her father in her mind, which really highlighted how our past experiences can influence our present relationships without us even realizing it.
Yeah, it's we carry these unconscious templates around with us.
Yeah.
And they're often formed in childhood, and we project them onto the people in our lives.
Wow.
So, for example, someone who had a really critical or emotionally distant father might find themselves drawn to partners who unconsciously replicate those dynamics.
That's a scary thought. It makes you wonder what kind of unconscious patterns you're playing out in your own relationships.
It's true. And that's where self-awareness is so important. Peterson talks a lot about the importance of listening, and not just listening to others, but also listening to ourselves. What are those inner voices saying? What are the patterns in our thoughts and our behaviors?
Right. He argues that, like, really listening can actually be this form of,
Yeah.
like, self-discovery, right?
Exactly. By genuinely listening to someone, by really trying to understand their perspective, it can give us insights into our own biases, our own assumptions.
Why?
It's about creating a space for deeper understanding, both within ourselves and in our relationships. And this all ties into that whole idea of order and chaos that Peterson talks so much about.
Okay, so how does listening fit into that?
Think of it this way. When we listen with genuine curiosity, we're creating order. A sense of understanding amidst all the chaos of miscommunication and differing viewpoints. It's like building a bridge instead of just further separating ourselves from each other.
That's a really nice way to put it.
Yeah.
He also talks about this idea of the extensible boundaries of the self, which I thought was really intriguing.
Oh, yeah. So that's this idea that our sense of self isn't limited to our physical bodies.
Okay.
But it can actually expand to encompass the people we love, our communities, even our possessions. It's like those Russian nesting dolls, where each doll contains a smaller version of itself. We exist within all these different layers of connection, and what impacts one layer is inevitably going to impact the others.
So if I'm understanding correctly, harming someone else from this perspective is essentially harming yourself.
Exactly. It challenges us to recognize that interconnectedness and to act with the understanding that our actions, they have ripple effects far beyond just our immediate sphere. And that's where Peterson's emphasis on personal responsibility takes on a whole new meaning.
So it's not just about taking care of ourselves, but it's also about recognizing our responsibility to the larger whole.
Yes, exactly. And that our choices, they have the power to either contribute to order or chaos, both in our own lives and in the world around us.
We've touched on some pretty heavy topics.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, how does Peterson address those who are already struggling, like those who are feeling really overwhelmed by life's challenges?
He uses this really interesting analogy of the supersaturated solution to illustrate how even small interventions can have a huge impact on someone who's on the verge of change. Imagine a solution that's completely full, it's on the brink of crystallization, and all it takes is a single grain, a catalyst, to trigger this dramatic transformation.
So it's like that one small change, that one moment of insight can have this huge ripple effect, shifting everything.
Exactly. And he connects this to the power of therapy, how even these seemingly small interventions by a therapist can provide the framework for someone to start creating order in their lives.
That's a really powerful image. He also talks a lot about his daughter, Michaela, and her struggles with severe juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. It's a reminder that even those closest to us experience really profound suffering.
Her story is it's incredible. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Michaela's faced unimaginable pain, yet she sought out alternative treatments, she challenged conventional medical approaches, and she ultimately found a path towards healing.
It's amazing.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. There's always the potential for transformation.
Her story really underscores that idea of taking responsibility for your own well-being, even when you're faced with these incredible challenges.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of, seeking out different perspectives, of not being afraid to challenge the status quo when it comes to our own health and well-being.
Before we move on to part 3 of your deep dive, where we'll explore Peterson's thoughts on societal structures and gender dynamics, what's one key takeaway you hope listeners will reflect on from what we've discussed so far?
I think the most important thing to remember is that Peterson's work, it isn't about providing these easy answers or telling people what to think. It's about encouraging self-reflection, taking responsibility for our choices, and being willing to grapple with life's complexities.
It's about asking the tough questions, the ones that maybe make us squirm a bit. And in those questions, we can maybe find a path toward a more meaningful life. I'm ready for part 3, are you?
Let's do it.
One thing I've always appreciated about Peterson is that he doesn't shy away from those big philosophical questions. He's going there. Good and evil, the meaning of life, even the nature of reality itself. It's not your typical self-help book.
Definitely not. He's not afraid to really dive into those deep waters. And I think what's so interesting is how he connects those really big ideas to everyday life.
Right.
He'll go from discussing ancient myths to, giving advice on how to discipline your kids, all in the same breath.
Yeah. It's he sees these like profound connections between our like inner world and the outer world. Like that rule, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Like on the surface, it's about keeping your room tidy, but it goes deeper. It's about taking responsibility for your own life before trying to, fix the world.
Yes, absolutely. It's about recognizing that the outer world is often a reflection of our inner state. So if we're surrounded by chaos in our personal lives, it's going to be that much harder to create order anywhere else, right?
Right. And speaking of chaos, Peterson talks a lot about this concept of order and chaos, like as these fundamental forces in the universe.
Yeah. He uses this image of a frozen lake with a hole in it.
Okay.
So on the surface, it's solid, it seems safe, but underneath, there's always that potential for things to, break down, for chaos to erupt. And that's kind of the reality we live in, both individually and as a society.
Yeah. It's a little unnerving when you really think about it, like that potential for things to just fall apart, which maybe explains why he puts so much emphasis on like having those rules, those principles to guide us.
Exactly. It's like having a compass,
Yeah.
when you're navigating through unfamiliar territory. Those rules, they give us a framework for creating order, for making sense of all the chaos.
And, some of those rules are definitely more challenging than others. Like when he talks about the importance of confronting our own shadows, it's not exactly a feel-good message.
It's not always easy to look at those darker parts of ourselves, the envy, the resentment, the pettiness. But Peterson argues that if we don't acknowledge those shadows, they'll just end up controlling us.
Yeah. It's like that saying, what you resist persists.
Exactly. And he uses the biblical story of Cain and Abel to really illustrate this. Cain, who was consumed by envy and resentment, he ends up murdering his own brother.
Right.
It's a cautionary tale for sure. It's about the destructive power of those unacknowledged, unintegrated shadow aspects.
So how do we even begin to confront those shadows?
Well, Peterson talks about the importance of self-awareness, being really honest with ourselves about our motivations. And it's not about judging ourselves harshly, but it's about simply acknowledging those, like less than desirable parts of our nature.
Yeah. And from that place of self-awareness, maybe we can start to make different choices. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Right.
From lobsters and serotonin to like ancient myths and biblical stories.
It's a lot. It's a lot to process. Peterson's work is definitely like that. It's thought-provoking, it's challenging, sometimes it's even like uncomfortable. But it's often in that discomfort that we find the greatest potential for growth.
It's about asking those tough questions, ones that make us squirm a little bit. And in those questions, maybe finding a path toward a more meaningful life.
Exactly. It's not about finding all the answers, but it's about embracing that journey of self-discovery.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. We've explored his thoughts on everything from cleaning your room to confronting your shadow, and hopefully spark some reflection along the way.
And remember, Peterson's work, it's a starting point. It's an invitation to engage with those big questions, to take responsibility for our choices, and to really strive to become the best versions of ourselves.
Yes. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you'll join us again next time as we delve into a new set of listener-submitted materials. Until then, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.